I would like to talk about our speaker, Dave Shadron. He has over 30 years experience and managing partner of Organized Change Consultancy. Okay, organizedchange.com. National and international clients include those in manufacturing, banking, finance, petrochemicals, electronics, and aerospace in the United States, France, Germany, Portugal, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. He has spoken at numerous national and local conferences and has been a major speaker at international broadcast teleconferences to over 35,000 people on organizational change, total quality management, and reengineering, systems thinking, and strategic planning. He holds doctorates and masters in industrial organized psychology, and he's the author of numerous articles and 3 books. So I'd like to introduce Dave. Dave, please take over, and thank you for speaking tonight.
As Greg has said, that I've been doing this for a while. I've been doing it on my own since 1991 and as an internal consultant since 1985. So put it this way, that I've seen many, many things go on in organizations across a fairly wide variety of them. I've worked in 19 countries and seen, to be frank about it, pretty much the same kind of patterns as what you see from one country to the other country, organization to the other organization. And so in response to that, let me put this in a little bit in context. One of the things that what I have been startled by in my 30 plus years of experience is on how often people do not look an organization as a system. In other words, as a series of components that work together. They have inputs, processes, outputs, feedback loop, and that they all interact. And I have so often seen where what people are trying to do with the best of intentions put in something that is really quite inappropriate to the organization. And that's a very sad thing, because it means a lot of wasted money, and to be frank about it, a lot of wasted time and effort along with it. It may be a way of paying consultants a lot of money, but ultimately it doesn't do anybody good in the long run. So one of the things you may learn in working with consultants is that everybody has a 2x2 matrix, and that I'm no exception to that. And so let me show you the first one here. Come on. So when we start dealing with these issues in organizations, and this is unfortunately one of the differences between when you get a chance to design a system from scratch and also when you begin to design a new organization, is that when you design a new organization, when you design a new system, excuse me, in that particular case, what you really are trying to do, you're trying to create a system that not only provides good output and provides good service to whatever the mission may be in the organization, but hopefully you design it for being able to design and understand what problems are going on, have a clear understanding about what causes those problems, that you can isolate what is going on, and based upon that, come up with a fairly rigorous solution about what's going to be needed to be accomplishing whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And as far as technical systems are concerned, especially in the design of them, that kind of approach can work. Unfortunately, with organizations, it's a lot messier. And the messiness is not just a little messy, sometimes it's really, really messy. And that sometimes what happens is that it's like taking a ball of string, putting it in glue, and then trying to tease out a single thread. That's the good part. If it's really bad, it's like a hairball, and that it's almost impossible to tease out what's causing what, and becomes very difficult in terms of trying to help an organization solve their problems. And I'll give an example of that. So we were working with a telecommunications company. This was a subsidiary of a French organization. And the CEO had somehow figured out that the company had a morale problem. So they were having problems with job satisfaction among the engineers and staff support people that they had in the company. And so we were called in to be doing an employee survey to find out what kind of morale problems were going in the organization. Based upon the survey, to everyone's surprise, including me, They didn't have a morale problem. People were actually quite happy with their work, and it showed in the survey results. Where the cause of the issues in the organizations was a strategic one. That is that some of senior management wanted to go in one direction. The rest of senior management wanted to go in a different direction. And because of their almost warfare between the two sides, the people were feeling that, and they were very unhappy about that. So as a result, what can happen is that you say, well, gee, we just have a morale problem, right? No, it turns out the cause of the problems is a completely different level in the organization. And unfortunately, that kind of thing happens quite often. So in response to that is that this is my 2x2 matrix. And to some extent, this is really a fairly simple kind of a thing. And it really, most for certainly, should be pretty obvious to most of you about how it works. So if you take a look on the x-axis, you can see the severity of the problem going from low to high. And on the y-axis, you can see the extent of the problem. So in the lower left-hand corner, you're talking about a problem that's not that severe and that may be affecting only 1 or 2 people. In that particular kind of circumstance, certainly you would not want to be using some major organizational change to be dealing with this issue. Simply just a coaching situation may be good, or deliver some 360 feedback and the coaching around that, may potentially be firing a person or move them around to a different position. On the other hand, a team might have some modest problems. And based upon that, you might be doing some team building, you might be doing some management training and coaching in response to that. If on the other hand, you have these modest problems across several groups, then you're starting to use a different set of techniques. Now you're potentially talking about coordination issues between groups. And when you start talking about that, then things start getting a little bit complicated. There can be some circumstances where the extent of the problem affects the whole company, but the severity is really not very high. So it's kind of nice when you deal with these kind of organizations that are kind of on the left-hand side with the graph that you see, because they're really pretty simple. And so based upon their simplicity, you can probably come up with some fairly easy recommendations about what to do. Unfortunately, when you bring in a consultant or when you have to deal with these situations, usually the situation is such that it's well above and beyond the slight, simpler problems. Usually they begin to become more severe and more widespread. And as a consequence of that, there may be some other things which you may need to do. And this is where organizations really get into problems. And the reason for this really is twofold. Is first of all, the management may not really understand the extent of the problem. The other particular kind of problem that can occur is that senior management especially may really have this idea that they really need to introduce this great new buzzword that they heard about in some other organization that they had success doing it. And for example, is that they may have heard of Agile. And they say, wow, this company really did some great stuff with Agile. We need to do Agile. Let's everybody do it in our company. Without really looking at the spread of problems to what they have, and even seeing if Agile has anything to do with being able to solve them. And so you get that kind of issue. The other kind of issue, unfortunately, that you get is you get people like me. That is consultants who basically have a bag of tricks, and that no matter what you ask them, they said, yes, we can do it. And based upon that, yes, we can do it, they then have to choose from what limited problem-solving tools of what they have. And I've seen it all too often happen where consultants come in, they put in some management training when lack of skill is not the cause of the problem. And lots of time and effort is put into it, and there are no results. To give a very bad example of that, is that there was one organization, and I will not name what that is, it's a very large organization, and they had done 360 feedback, that is feedback from all the people around a person of their top 3,000 managers. Sounds like a good thing. Sounds like it very might be useful. Unfortunately, 3 years later, all of those feedback documents were still in cardboard boxes. They had spent all that time and money, collected all that kind of data, and it literally just ended up in a storeroom somewhere, and it never was used. It was so bad that the head of organizational development at that company came to me and said, we need to come up with a different name for my organization, because organizational development is tied so much so with that failed effort that we have to change it just for marketing reasons. I mean, it really became that bad. What you get when you have so many consultants wandering around is that everybody has their own toolkit, and they all try to tweak it just a little bit so it sounds unique to them. And as a result of that, what happens is that you then get these hundreds, if not thousands, of different techniques that on the surface are very different from each other, but if you dig down to it, are very much the same. And so in response to that, this is where this graph comes in. And this is where you can categorize different techniques. And depending upon those techniques, you can figure out what set of techniques you can use depending upon the extent and severity of the problem that what you have. Okay? And that what we have done is basically come up, come on. There we go. You can look at these kind of different ways of changing organizations into four broad categories. One particular category is what we call level 4 changes. Basically, those level 4 changes are those things that where you have a modest problem that affect a relatively few number of people. Level 3 kind of changes are those things where the problem is generally more severe, or the gap between where you are and where you want to be is rather substantial, and the extent of the problem may be affecting several groups. Level 1 and level 2 kind of changes, though, are used in those situations where the severity of the problem is high, or the gap between where you want to be and where you are now is quite large, and the extent of the problem pretty well covers the entire organization. So that's, if you will, my first slide, and in a brief moment, I'll be getting back to what I mean by level 3 and level 4 changes. But what I wanted to do right now is I wanted to open up the chat, and I wanted to get your feedback and comments and questions at this time. And if you will, please go to the chat window so you can type your initial questions. And then based upon that, I can answer that. And if necessary, I can unmute some of the mics. Oops. So for the moment, I'm going to do it there, all right? So open up the chat here and see what we get. So please, type in your questions there. You got to ask something. That's an interesting question. This is from Michael. Is it not a system of systems? That is actually one way of looking at that. This is true. And that when you look at organizations, you really need to be looking at them from a multi-level perspective. And that is oftentimes, again, where people who don't have a lot of experience in consulting tend to miss the boat. That is, the organization is a system. It is composed of other systems. Those systems are composed of other systems. And depending upon the complexity of the organization, to be frank about it, it can even go down many more levels than that. And I'm going to, Michael, I'm going to try to do this here just a moment. I don't know if I can. Michael, there you go. There you go. Can you hear me, Michael?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, great, thank you. And so you are now unmuted, so be willing to say whatever you want to in public.
Yes, yeah, we often see that the system itself is a socio-technical system, and it's comprised of many systems, like you had mentioned. And we often wonder, since sometimes it's an open system and not a closed system, what should the system be optimized for? And it should have optimizing values. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Michael, I'm going to just mute you for the moment, and I can always unmute you later, please. Is that is really is a good question. And what Michael was referring to is the sociotechnical systems approach. If you want to look back historically, that was actually started in the 1950s. There was a seminal article in that called the long wall method of coal getting, in terms of they restructured how a coal mine did their thing and substantially changed and improved their productivity as a result. One of the things what is really important when you deal with these kind of circumstances is that it really goes back to Michael in terms of what to optimize and what the goal is, but it also depends upon another factor, again, what most organizations don't consider. And that is, organizations for the most part consider the future will be like the past. And as a result, they need to be optimizing their systems to be accommodating what they believe to be the future. And as you can certainly be seeing lately, there can be some real qualitative changes that happen in the world and that really put a whole lot of stress on people. And that unless you have at least partly anticipated those kind of radical changes, it may be very difficult for you to be accommodating the future circumstances. And as a result, it may be very difficult to be optimizing the systems that are trying to accomplish that. Okay, Grace, I'm going to try to go to you just a moment. Grace, I think you're from Australia. You're from Australia, right? Grace, you're from Australia?
Yes.
Ah,
Yeah. Yes,
good.
I am.
Yeah, but you're not all burned up.
Here.
Yes, you're not all burned up from the fires or drowned in the rains.
It's raining now.
Oh.
Yeah. So what I was really asking was that, when you're looking at how to categorize the extent of the problem, it really depends on the time, right? Because
right.
What can seem like it's only affecting 1 to 2 people may, if given time and as things, chains of events happen, it might actually affect the whole company if you don't look at it.
Yes, it very well can, and I'll give an example of that, and also go back to your questions about these interaction kind of issues. So I was doing some team building actually when 2 organizations were merging, and this was an international organization, part of a large firm, and I was doing some team building between the Saudis and the Americans. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what was going on. I really couldn't. Did an employee survey. A little bit came out of that. Did the interviews of everybody. A little bit came out of that, but not much. And I was really puzzled because I'm thinking, when I see these people working together in groups and working on the problem solving stuff that I was giving them, they seem to be really well organized. They broke up into groups well, they chose a facilitator, they chose a scribe, so on and so on, all the good process kind of stuff that what I would come to expect from a well-functioning group. But there was just something that was funny, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then finally, in observing them even more, it finally hit me on the head. What was going on is all the Americans were running the show, and all the Saudis were being passive. And that was the distinguishing little problem, if you will, that I finally said. And what was going on, what was called an Abilene Paradox. And an Abilene Paradox is where people think they're going in the same direction, but they're not actually. Everybody thinks everybody else wants to go there, but it turns out no one wants to go there. And so the Americans who were making the decisions, they were not trying to incorporate the opinions and feelings of the Saudis. And as a result, they weren't getting really good accomplishments because they were leaving half their team behind. So again, what seemed on the surface to be not any problem at all looking at in more detail, it turns out that, gosh darn it, there were some real issues that were going on in terms of how people were interacting. And David, let me see if I can find you here, just a moment. Oh, there we go, sorry. Hello, David.
Hi, David.
You were talking about an organization as a complex system that you can't figure out everything.
Right. For me, every system has human operators, and the human operators introduce a level of complexity over and above any complexity of the software or hardware. So, and I'm going by the definition of that INCOSE uses, where it's the outputs are emergent and the interfaces are not fully understood. Certainly, that human behavior fits that definition to a T, I think.
It does, and that for better or for worse, if we were only having to deal with people, it would make it a lot easier. But unfortunately, what happens, and Dave, I'm sorry that I lost where you are here. My apologies. Because we got a fair number of people going on here. Anyway, but the additional issue is that you also have technical things going on. I mean, for example, if you introduce a new IT system that people are having problems dealing with, gosh darn it, that's going to be causing an interaction between all the group dynamics issues with the people. And then you combine that with the constraints the organization has, with the mission that the organization has, and then you add on the layer on top of that in the environment. You're really starting to talk about a pretty gosh darn big messy situation here when you try to actually find out what's going on and what's not. And like I said, that's the reason why you bring in somebody, but gosh darn, it's a tough issue. It really is a very tough issue to be dealing with. And as I just said, I know that I've been doing this for a while and I've been surprised. So it's an interesting situation, like I said, when you deal with these complexities, for sure. And I'm sorry, there was another particular kind of question. I'm sorry, give some examples of level 1, 2, 3, and 4 techniques. And that came from Ralph. And Ralph, I'll be glad to go into that on the next slide. And then if you have any other questions for like that, if you go ahead and repeat yourself in the group chat, I'll be more than glad to answer those. Hope that's okay with you. And let's see if there's anything else. Nope, not anything else at the moment. All right, so let me go back to the slide here. All right, so sorry, keeps on wanting to jump ahead for some reason. So when I'm talking about level 1, 2, 3, and 4 techniques, these are, again, very broad categories. And sometimes things are not easily fit into one level or not, but these are at least some broad aspects in terms of how we want to be changing organizations. And if you will, I want to talk first about level 4. Level 4 techniques, if you want to go think about the last slide, level 4 techniques are really dealing with when you have problems that with a relatively small number of people and that the severity of the problems is not that great. And some of the things that, I apologize for it going on again, is that some of the things that are in that aspect would be problem solving teams. It would be putting in Six Sigma total quality management. It would be doing 360 feedback and executive coaching, that kind of thing. And I might anticipate some pushback from you folks, kind of saying, you know, gosh darn it, what do you mean? I mean, Six Sigma is a pretty gosh darn big thing, right? Well, it is. And I've helped implement it. But relative to the other sets of techniques, it's a pretty small kind of thing. Now, mind you, you really can get some fantastic results out of doing so. But with Six Sigma, for example, what you're really trying to do, you're trying to optimize existing processes. What if the processes don't need to be done at all? What if the organization should be doing completely different things? In that kind of circumstance, Six Sigma by itself is not really going to be helping you. And there's another question here, isn't our job basically be dealing with this complexity? And you're right. I mean, that's what management is for, is really be dealing with this kind of complexity. But even though people have lots of experience, it can still get kind of gosh darn tough to figure out what's going on, to be frank about it. Level 3 techniques really involve around such things as putting in what most people would call major system changes. For example, they are going to be changing their ERP system from whatever they were doing before. They're going to be integrating everything and be using SAP instead. They are going to be reorganizing the company so it's not functionally oriented. Instead, it's actually going to be more customer focused and customer organized. Those are the kind of level 3 kind of techniques that might be an example of that. Level 2 kind of things, that normally is what's called strategic planning. And that has to do with doing your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, be looking at market segmentation, be looking at new opportunities, doing competitive analysis, defining what the mission of the company should be, defining your core competencies, those kind of aspects to it. And normally you'd be putting a label of, again, strategic planning as far as that's concerned. On the other hand, what we call level 1 techniques really has to do with changing and anticipating the future. And you may think a little bit about that and kind of say, what do you mean changing the future? Well, oftentimes the best way for a company to be successful is to make the future happen and where it will be successful. And I'll provide an example of that in just a moment. On the other hand, if an organization may not be able to change the future, at least they may be able to anticipate at least some aspects of it. And based upon that, they can at least be partly prepared for what goes on. So that kind of is, before I go into specific examples, this is kind of the way of categorizing methods of organizational change. Again, level 4, small incremental change. Level 3, making fundamental change as far as processes and systems and structure is concerned. Level 2 has to do with strategic planning. And level 1 has to do with what's called scenario planning and changing and anticipating the future. So before I get into any specific examples of this in terms of what's going on in the industry as well as my own experience, what kind of comments and questions do you have? Come on, somebody has to have one. Okay, I'll go ahead and go on and give you some examples. Oh, sure. And let me, you can start with level 4 or start with level 1. Let me start with some level 1 examples. So there was a publicly traded company, in this particular case, it was in Saudi Arabia. And they wanted to put something in place that was counter-cyclical to the business cycle that they were in. So in other words, they would be making money when their other parts of the business weren't making money. And they had about $1 billion to spend. And so what we did for them is that we developed 4 scenarios about what the Middle East might look like 15 years from then. And then led the then board of directors into thinking about, if this kind of scenario happens, what should the company do? If this kind of scenario happens, what should the company do? And those particular kind of scenarios involve things like the changing price of oil, which you know has pretty much collapsed in the last couple of months, and whether Iran gets a nuclear weapon, and to the extent that there is social unrest inside the country. In addition to that, there were some technological factors just in terms of, as you know, Saudi Arabia is a heavily oil-dependent country in regards to what new and oncoming technologies may actually reduce the amount of oil that is needed. And as a consequence to that, how is the company going to be surviving and growing? So what they did is when they went through these scenarios, is they realized they didn't have the right people on the board of directors. Because what they had decided to do in response to these scenarios is basically get into what the United States call low-level manufacturing. And low-level manufacturing is not something that what any of them had any experience in at all. And if you are familiar with most boards of directors of public companies, is that usually there are finance people involved, usually there are investors involved, but oftentimes there are a fair number of technical experts that are actually part of the board of directors itself. Actually in Germany, we call it the supervisory board. And so based upon that, I said, well, how is the board going to be making decisions about manufacturing kind of things when you don't have any experience at all? And they says, oh, that's okay. We'll go ahead and hire consultants. And I said, no. You shouldn't be hiring consultants. You should actually be having people on the board that have done these kind of things for a long while. There was some pushback, but they finally agreed to that. And the next time that I went over to them, what they had done is actually had brought in 2 people with manufacturing experience onto the board of directors that all total had 35 or 40 years worth of experience in the areas. And I think they were going to be much more successful there as a result. Level 2 kind of things, there was a company, and what they did is that they made, they made cameras. Not the Sony kind of cameras, but basically the cameras that you use for surveillance and for observation. And they were stuck market-wise. And as a consequence to their being stuck, they brought us in and realized that there were vast new markets that they had never even tapped. Because what they were doing is they were going after the market for these cameras that were large scale. So in other words, people were buying hundreds and thousands of them at one time, and that these were new installations. That is that the organization and their facilities did not have any security cameras to begin with, and that was really their main focus. Unfortunately, that was also the focus of a lot of their competitors, and they were really having some real major problems with that. So it turned out the sweet spot where they could actually do something and their competitors were not is in terms of putting in large camera systems and taking out old ones. So in other words, ripping out the old stuff and putting in new stuff. And that would have been a vast market for them because the installed base for that was so much larger than the new installations as a consequence. In regards to level 3, is that we're working with one particular company and we did an employee survey, and turns out that there are a number of issues that were going on inside the organization, some of them having to do with fairness, promotions, and rewards. And also the customer base was changing, and there was also a new vice president that had gone in there. And so as a consequence, what happened of all the surveys and working with senior management, what they did is that they reorganized the reorganization so that instead of it being function by function, it was now organized customer by customer. They also put in a new measurement system so everyone was clear in terms of what needed to be measured. And the other thing what they did, they put in a new employee selection and promotion system that substantially changed the very informal system in terms of what they had. In terms of level 4, Six Sigma kind of things, is that, again, Six Sigma can doing a lot of different kind of positive aspects to the organization. And with one particular team that we were working with, is they, of all things, we're trying to save a lot of titanium. As some people might know, is that titanium is a very expensive metal, very expensive and very hard to manipulate. And through using Six Sigma, they were able to save the company $250,000 a year in titanium scrap. And that's what I call a great accomplishment for them to be able to do that kind of thing. Okay, so I've been talking a whole lot, but please give me some questions, please. See, I know someone in the audience, his name is there we go. The question, yeah, that's a darn good question. Let me go off to, okay, they're coming up rather rapidly here. Hold on 1 sec. Is that, yeah, so in terms of visualizing the system, Tiana, I'm going, and actually Tiana and Ibra, sorry, there are multiple similar kind of questions. So just a second here. So let me, Tiana, let me find you. Okay, oh, there we go, sorry. People can, Tiana, where are you? Tyler, Stan, Lauren. Is that Tiana? I apologize, I can't find you at the moment, so I'll try to answer your questions as best that I can without getting additional feedback. Some odd reason it's just not popping up here. In any case, so it really depends upon the initial scope of the problem. So one of the things in terms of what we do as far as diagramming is concerned or visualizing is concerned, which is where your question came into be, is that we come up with assuming for example, we're talking about level 1 and level 2, is what we do, for example, is let's say that we take 20 of the top executives and that they're going to go through a scenario planning and strategic planning exercise. So I don't mean to make this a promotional kind of thing, but we have software to do this. And that what we then do is we actually break them up into groups, and each group is assigned a scenario. And then based upon the scenario, they basically do a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis. And that comes up into a grid that's a 10 by 10 grid where it compares what the needs are for the organization, compared that to the current capabilities. And I can't quite call that up quite spontaneously because I'd have to go into the software to do that, but hopefully you get the visual for doing that kind of a thing. In regards to some of the other visualizations is that if we can also be doing diagramming of team behaviors, so be doing an analysis by check marking in terms of who talks to whom when, and you can be seeing what various kind of patterns as far as communication is concerned. In regards to employee surveys, which is another whole topic by itself, is we actually use the equivalent of Pareto charts, and based upon the severity of what's going on in the organization, and help the organization do the problem solving that goes along with that. In regards to visualizing in terms of the incremental problem solving, the level 4 kind of things, is that the whole set of patterns and techniques in Six Sigma are way, way too big for me to be getting into here. But certainly a number of those visualization techniques can certainly be used. Yeah, this is, okay, basically go back to Rodney. Rodney, I'll see if I can find you again. Rodney, here you go, Rodney. Rodney.
Good evening.
Good evening. You were talking about the little guy.
Yeah, that's me.
Okay. Tell me more about what you mean about the little guy in a large organization.
Yeah, well, I'm in San Diego. The organization is headquartered in Orlando, Florida. I work remotely. I work with So yeah, that's what and as I said in the chat window, I manage about 15 volunteers for 5 languages as they translate from English into their mother tongue. It's a new way of doing Bible translation. The world of Bible translation was essentially turned upside down by this approach in 2014, and it was disruptive as well as transformational. But it's very successful. It's helping to nationalize the work instead of ethnocentric work here centered in the United States or the Western world. So, hey, I'm just a little guy. I'm a systems guy. I love process and systems engineering thoughts. This is 3rd career. I come out of the military and then out of defense consulting. So it's just a general question.
Yeah.
What kinds of things can I, as a little guy, do to, get some traction within an organization that's in constant change?
Yeah, and that's a very difficult circumstance because you understand a lot of the problems going on in an organization, but you don't have control.
Right.
And that's a very stressful situation to be in. And it all depends upon how much perseverance you have. You can try to find out who the influencers are in the organization and try to be working with them, be by amplifying the amount of power and authority that which you have in the company, or in this case, the organization, nonprofit organization. And then on that particular kind of basis, work with them to kind of, move things along a little bit. If there's some other opportunity, if they are doing some kind of assessment or survey work, there would be your chance to be voicing your opinion in some kind of anonymous kind of way. Ultimately, though, what often happens when, quote, the little guy is caught in a situation like that, it may become intolerable for them, and it may be best if they leave.
Okay.
I mean, not that I'm just saying that's a good thing, but I'm saying that just may be the alternative. Kind of say, you know what, I can't control anything. I'm not happy about it, so I'm going to find something else to do.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I appreciate that. I do have a pretty good manager. And he seems to be influential, although I don't think he's as connected as I'd like to have him be connected. But pretty happy in the new role. It's the 3rd one in the organization. Got a chance to see 2 other roles, and what works and what doesn't work. And so, thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Okay, so Jeff Lauren. Oh, there we go, sir. That's where you were. Jeff.
Just a point for consideration. Complex systems are emergent by nature. Human behavior creates emergence by nature. People are the element of an organization. They're if you start decomposing the organization into its constituent elements and systems and subsystems, you get down to people. That's the source of your uncertainty.
It is. It's also the opportunity to be making big change, all depending upon how you want to be doing that. And I'll give an example. Thank you, Jeff. Is that we were working with one organization, the one I was just referring to, that was changing their selection process for incoming employees, and justifying the process in conjunction with everybody, getting lots of employee input, stakeholders involved, so forth and so on. But the first guy who was going to be going through the process, his name was Jeff. And I went up to Jeff and I said, Jeff, we have this new process. Do you have any questions? Do you have anything I can do to be helping you? Anything else like that? And he said, no, because I'm not going to use it. And I said, it's policy now. He says, yeah, I know, I'm not going to use it. I go, okay. So I went into my boss's office, and my boss was named Dave also. And this was Jeff's boss's boss. And I said to Dave, I said, Dave, you know, we have the new process. Yeah, of course he knows, he helped design it. We have Jeff who's going to be starting the first one to go through the process. He says, okay. It says, Jeff has not said he's not going to use it. And Dave said, okay. Calls Jeff into the office and asks him one question. You want to keep your job? And you know, it's just amazing on how quickly Jeff changed his mind. He was really enthusiastic about the process. So if you can get that kind of, you know, persuasive abilities or abilities for authority to be changing things, it is amazing based on using on the people on how much you can be getting done. Okay, sorry, going on to Mario. You had a question on diagramming for there too. Just a moment, let me get to you here. Sorry, it's taking me for so long to be getting to the exact person, but they don't show people in alphabetical order. So it's, oh, they gotta go. Oh, there we go. There we go. Mario. Hi, Mario. How you doing? Mario? You there? Okay, maybe he's having problems with his mic. I can always go back to him later. And Giselle? Sorry. Where'd Giselle? Where'd you go? Giselle, for some odd reason, you're not popping up. So I have to try to answer your question on my own here. Her question was, how much change can you realistically expect to make in an organization, a large organization, 500 plus? 500 people is not a large organization. That's actually a pretty small one. A medium-sized organization, at least in the US, is like 10,000 employees. And the larger organizations are, you know, 100,000, 200,000, a million employees. So a large organization, at least by the 500 people standard, is actually considered to be a small business by US standards. If you can get the right people involved at the beginning, if there is an urgent problem that they either recognize or they are persuaded to see, you would be amazed about what kind of changes can actually occur. You have to be frank about it, when you start contemplating that kind of organizational change, you really have to stack the deck at the very, very beginning in order for it to be successful. If all that what you have to want to do is try to put in change management at the very end of that decision-making process, it's not likely to be very successful. You really have to my mind, like I said, stack the deck at the very beginning, and that way you'll have a substantially increase of being successful. And to the point where we were doing, I think there was one question regarding to employee surveys. We were doing one employee survey with this actually was a French public company that was a roll-up. That is, in other words, it was lots of mergers and acquisitions that happened as a result of it. And we did the employee survey, and believe it or not, as a result of the employee survey, the CEO got fired. So sometimes substantial change can actually happen in surprising places. Tiana. Ah, sorry, now I see you. Now I see you. Hold on a second, Tiana. There we go. Hi, Tiana.
Hi there.
So where are you from now?
I'm in Brooklyn.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There's a bad joke I know about Brooklyn. I'll tell you that later. Go on.
Okay. Yeah, just to add some more context. Actually, Michael, who you talked to earlier, we work together. We had an initiative we were working on that actually, it seemed we were working with, I think, the right people, but at some point they didn't quite understand the systems aspect of it, and like the sort of like the approach to understanding the system and looking for those like leverage points and layers of things that you can start to look at to change, prioritizing also what is like the goal strategically as well.
Yeah.
And a lot of the efforts we put forth were turned into or looked at as kind of in a process improvement bucket, which just didn't seem to do justice to the actual work itself. Because I think there's some things that could be processed, some things that could be people, it could be around practices. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it, kind of like you talked through like the levels here as well. And so I think that's something I wanted to see, like how to help turn the conversation or turn the attention away from just process improvement and like elevate the whole conversation, elevate the work itself to what it really is.
Yeah, and that's a difficult situation to be in. It's kind of like they don't know what they don't know, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
And what I would, in that kind of circumstance, I might want to suggest training. And not training as in show them a PowerPoint, as in if you can develop simulations for them to use.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, okay, so we do this, and we do this, and we do this. And if you set up the simulations right, then what happens is something unexpected.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can kind of connect the dots, even though they're not physically close to each other, as a consequence to that. So, there's business, and this is not quite my expertise, the actual software itself, but the business simulation software. And there are actually some paper and pencil kind of exercises that also illustrate this as well. But in that kind of circumstance, and I don't always recommend training because I think training is really overused. Mm-hmm. If it's used well, it's great, but oftentimes it's overused in the wrong context. And in this particular case, I think that it would be.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Yep, thanks.
Okay. Where'd you go? Okay, all right. All right, so a couple other of the different ones here. Yeah, and Michael, just a comment from Jeff, just in terms of the systems thinking stuff is also very, very important in that way. And that's kind of what I was saying. The one thing that you have to be careful about when you start talking about systems thinking and the should be state is that you really need to tie that in with scenarios. Otherwise, as the people are going to be thinking the future is going to be like the past, or if they develop a so-called vision statement, that everything is going to be going in accordance with the vision. And to my mind, that's not a good recipe for success. You really need to be thinking about multiple end states, and the end state may be very different depending upon which scenario plays out. So I just kind of put that in context, if you will. And there is a question from Ibrahim. Ibrahim seems Al-Nassar. Let me see if I can find you here. There we go. Ibrahim Al-Nassar, assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me, Ibrahim? I guess not. Okay, so I'll go ahead and meet you there. In that particular case, in terms of a startup for a nice system, is that I think one of the classic examples is really in terms, well, there can be several different ones of them, but oftentimes one side in the United States is actually something of an old one, and that is with the Saturn car. Is that when General Motors created the Saturn car factory in Tennessee, they really started a lot of different processes, actually getting people involved from the very start before the actual plant was actually produced, actually created. So the people who are working in the plant were actually the ones who helped design the plant. And so in essence, they were really creating their own work. And as a result, they had high levels of job satisfaction and they had high levels of productivity. Unfortunately, Saturn was not successful in the longer run because General Motors did not know how to deal with it very well. And they kind of let that division languish. And as a result, they really weren't successful, you know, over the decades, I'm sorry to say. All right, so let me go ahead and go on to the next slide here. So one of the things that what we use is what we call the equation for success when you start changing these systems. And that, minimize something here. And so if you want to look at it, is that if however you want to define success is a function of several different things whenever you start talking about organizational change. Is that one, it's a measurement question. That is that are you coming up with the right measures for success? Are you using the proper technique? You know, are you using the proper level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4 techniques? Are the systems, once you're done, going to be aligned with each other? To what extent do you have control over the situation? To what extent are you putting time, effort, money, and resources into it? That is focused persistence. And lastly, and not leastly, consensus. And you notice in this equation, if you will, that if any of these is 0, success is 0. You'll also notice is that because it's a multiplication kind of a thing, that if you do some things really, really well, it can at least partly compensate for those things that you can't quite control. Ideally, though, you want to have all of these particular kind of aspects that are really tied into what you want to be achieving. And I wanted to go a little bit more into alignment, okay? Because this issue in regards to alignment used to get a whole lot of press, probably about 10, 15 years ago, but for some reason has fallen out of fashion, at least to be talked about. But alignment based upon the last equation is critical. And there really needs to be an alignment between these very different aspects. First of all, there needs to be a clear understanding what the business situation and goals are. That needs to be closely aligned with what kind of changes you're going to be making. The organizational systems, structure, money, information systems, work processes, selection and training. Oops, sorry. Keeps on wanting to go ahead. These organizational systems all need to be working together, and it also needs to be aligned with the change in the business situations and goals. And that all really needs to be grabbed and focused and defined in terms of a good plan of action. So you can have a great plan of action, but if you're not changing systems, if you're not making the right changes, and you don't have the right goals for the company, it's not going to be working. If you have great systems, but the company is not going to be focused very well, you know, gosh darn it, that's not going to be successful either. So you really need to be having an alignment of all of these different components. And the greater alignment that what you have, the better off you're likely to be. And that part right there is actually the key to when people start talking about this alignment kind of a question, an organizational question. Because so many times what people do, sorry, keeps on going ahead. What consultants do is they focus just on one aspect. They just focus on consensus building. But they don't talk about technical systems. They don't talk about IT. They don't talk about organizational structure. They don't talk about scenarios. Those people who oftentimes talk about IT, those people who talk about work processes, don't really think in terms of what the organizational goals are. And so it almost is to the point where actually you have entirely different sets of consultants depending upon where you are in this pyramid. You have people who are tied into project management. That's the plan of action. You have other consultants that are tied into organizational systems. You have other kind of folks that are focused just on, I don't care what you want to change, I'll help you come up with a good way to persuade people. And you have other consultants that deal with scenario planning and strategic planning. And unfortunately, these particular people and these particular components don't often talk with each other. And organizational change and success can get kind of messy as a result. Okay. So that's going to be another stop time for me. I'm going to open up the chats. What kind of questions do you have? Tiana, that's a darn good question. I got to go back to you again. Tiana? Okay. Tiana, you're, sorry.
Oh.
All right, your mic's hot.
Okay. Yeah, so just thinking about the team I was working on doing this kind of work,
Yeah.
I think we had complementary skills. We were not a big enough team in terms of varied domains and company sizes and having seen a lot of things.
Right.
And one of us on the team actually having spent a lot of time as a leader. So having to deal with these bigger strategic questions and leading groups and like sparking change from a leadership perspective. And then another person with, coaching experience, actually, and a background in also other systems techniques and things like that. So I think it was nice because we bounce ideas and we could kind of like look at problems from different angles. So it got me thinking about if you were going to put a group together to kind of like do this kind of work, or put a team together within a company to do this kind of work, what would be some of the skills to make a very robust team and get things done? You kind of touched on it in your last comment about different people that are looking from different angles, like strategy or execution or that kind of thing, or very persuasive type individuals. So I wanted to play with that idea a little bit.
Sure. So if all that you're talking about is implementing what's already in concrete, yeah, you can have a fairly wide variety of skills to be doing that. All no more, no less than what you're doing at the time you're a pair of hands. Okay? In other words, you're executing the plan. Let me give you a counterexample. So what we did with one organization is that we asked the senior manager wanted to be doing something. I won't go into that. And they said, okay, so what we're going to do is help us define what power segments are in your organization. And as a result, they said, okay, these are the groups of people. And then we went to those groups and asked them to elect a leader who was influential among them. And that became the transformation group. So in other words, it was not based upon skill. Skills could be brought in. It was based upon power and the ability to influence. And so based upon that, we had, this is the oddest thing that what happened in that group. They gelled so well together that they were doing some problem solving, and I forget what the topic of the problem solving was. I said, I got to stop you for a minute, because the vice president was taking the union's point of view, and the union representatives were taking the senior management point of view. And, you know, gosh darn it, that's the symbol of a pretty gosh darn well-working team when you're taking completely opposite perspectives to what you normally might. So that has to do with team building and motivation and the like, but you had to get the people with the authority, with the power, formal and informal, in the room. Now, mind you can bring in other advisors, you know, the technical change process people, project management people, organizational change people, all that kind of stuff, you know, around there, right? But if those technical people can't be change agents, they can be hands, they can be advisors, but the change agents have to be the ones with power. And there's not too much a way around that. All right. There's some mention, I think, that Ruth gave some references and so on the like to some books. Mind you, by the way, is that the chats are not so easily copyable. So you might want to be kind of highlighting them and copying the whole chat area and popping them into Microsoft Word. It's not that amenable to grabbing a piece and taking it out, taking it elsewhere. Grace, let me grab you here. Grace.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, so it follows on, I guess, from Tiana's response about who should be in the team, what skills should be in the team. Well, rather than saying, "Oh, let's have all these 4 different layers and make sure they're alive," couldn't we actually just cross-cut vertically so you get the teams working together throughout, rather than saying you're all 4 working independently and then just trying to align them?
Yeah, and I agree with you. However, that kind of misalignment often does not happen. Or that alignment does not happen. The way that it really depends upon the presenting problem. Sometimes the presenting problem when people come to us isn't the real problem. And so sometimes you start at the bottom and kind of say, you know what, the reason this project won't work very well is because you got some higher up stuff that you have to deal with. My preferred approach is to be starting with scenario planning, do the strategy planning, do the major organizational systemic changes, and then do the maintenance stuff and design that kind of thing from the beginning, rather than kind of having all these kind of separate aspects that are eventually going to collide with each other, and they oftentimes do, I'm sorry to say. Does that kind of get to your question, Grace? I guess so. Hopefully so. If not, tell me. Let me know, please. So, okay, I've got about 8 minutes left. So I'm going to. Okay, Grace said mostly yes. Okay, good. Okay, good. Answer the question then. So I'm going to go to the. Come on. There we go. And I'm going to show you something that, to be frank about it, we're not going to have much time to get into. This is a model to what we used when we started talking about these things. And I think, Grace, in part, this answers your question more. And that what's really important to do, we call it up all the way here, given the limited time in terms of what we have, is that ideally, when you go into an organization, you really need to have some, what we call framework questions answered. And that is, who's going to be part of the steering committee? You know, who are those powerful people that you're going to be able to make decisions with? What kind of initial assessment are you going to be doing? What kind of scope of change are they going to be dealing with? Because sometimes, to be frank about it, senior management does not want to be answering the big questions. Sometimes they're only willing to be, sometimes they're only really willing to be answering the small ones, and that's okay. How are you going to be gaining consensus? Is this going to be a voting situation? Is this going to be a majority? Is the president just going to say, okay, this is the way we're going to do it, thank you very much? How are you going to be ensuring implementation? And how are you going to be evaluating what you do? So those kind of framework questions, at least to my mind, need to be answered first before you start even thinking about making any kind of organizational change. Based upon that, then the steering committee gets to be choosing what kind of level they're talking about, right? Are they willing to go through scenario planning? Are they willing to go through strategic planning? Are they willing to be making large-scale organizational change? Or are they willing to be putting in more maintenance kind of functions into there? Once that level is decided, then they can define the goals. Then you get the strategies and methods in terms of how you're actually going to be accomplishing this. Really have to more carefully define what your measurement system should be. And then based upon that, what your implementation plan should be. And so regardless of whatever level you play with, this is the general sequence of things that have to take it into account. Now, as part of this, there are some aspects that are not linear. That is that you just can't go from one to the other to the other. And so those involve things like additional assessments. There may be additional teamwork and consensus building activities. There may be additional training and learning that has to occur. And these can be inserted in any number of different places in this sequence. It just really kind of all depends upon what the circumstances are. But this will at least give you something of an idea in terms of on how to be dealing with organizational change, trying to integrate what you were talking about in terms of thinking about up front what you want to do, deciding on how big of a project this is going to be. You know, what do you want to achieve? How are you going to get there? How are you going to be knowing that you're going to be getting there, and what the implementation plan should be. And given all of that there, what questions do you have in the 5 minutes I have left? Yeah, I know, it's too much, I know, for 4 minutes. Now, I'm going to pick on somebody if you don't mind. Okay. When changing behavior, it's better to change the mind or the body first. Michael, the easy question is first. You change the body first. If you can change the body, the mind will follow. There's a bad way of putting that, but that's the nicer way of saying it. Yeah, Grace, thank you. You see, I was waiting for a question like that, asking about a good internet paper or book. What probably would be the easiest for you is if you, and I don't make this a promotional kind of a thing, but if you go to our website, and that's organizedchange.com, it has, I don't know how many articles on these topics. There's linked to our YouTube video channel with all sorts of different kind of videos related to this kind of aspect to it. There are various kind of tutorials that are involved in there, so on and so on and so on. So that's a pretty heavy resource just online. And if you want to actually grab a book, the latest one is called Nailing Strategy Jelly to Your Business Tree. And you can go ahead and order that on Amazon if you'd like. Be honest with you, though, is that most all of that stuff is actually on the website per se. Julia, you had a real good question. What do you do if the company manager wants you to solve a productivity problem when you suspect the problem is higher up? Well, if you're an employee, you kind of got to do as you're told, but you got to kind of tell that your boss kind of saying, you know what, I can go so far with this, but I can't fully bring in or accomplish what I want to accomplish because of this issue, and this issue. And so you need to have, however carefully, a fairly frank conversation with your boss, with the company manager, and kind of saying, look, I really want to achieve this, but I suspect there are some other issues that are going on, and try to bring the company manager into the loop and see what he or she says. Anything else? Oh, I'm sorry, Ibrahim was saying, what about branding issues? Branding issues should really be coming about after the strategic planning is done. Because otherwise you may need to become a very different company. And as a result, your brand needs to change, and your marketing itself needs to change, your customers may need to change, and certainly your branding may need to change. Yeah, Grace, that's a darn good question. Dealing with the complexity of working different organizational change and different initiatives happening at the same time. You know what? If that's not a coordinated effort in terms of different initiatives involved in that, you're going to be coming up with collisions and you're going to be coming up with major gaps. If there's a lack of coordination between those organizational change initiatives, that really needs to be brought up to senior management to see on how they can coordinate that. Because otherwise you're likely to be spending a whole lot of money and not be achieving too much, to be frank about it. Okay. And my friends, is that I am out of time. It is 7:30. Is that, if you will, Greg, is that I'm going to unmute your microphone for any last words that you might have?
The only thing I'd have to say is thank you, David, for presenting a very interesting topic tonight. I think we're all got to think something different for a change, instead of just strict, the engineering V. So we're thinking of things from a human perspective, which is really, I think, in a lot of ways harder to change than engineering and technical type stuff. So thanks again for presenting. Hopefully we can invite you back sometime next year for a different topic. And hopefully everybody enjoyed it tonight. And please check our website for upcoming events. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks again, folks. Thanks for all of your time, especially given a variety of time zones in terms of where you're from. All right. Take care of yourselves, and I wish you the best of luck.